Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Tales from the Crypt, Season 5. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins with Judd, who is a cemetery plot salesman, and he's extremely successful at work. But in his personal life, he's a terrible person, lying to women to get them into bed. The next morning, he acts like nothing happened, leaving without a second thought. One girl accused him of manipulating her hormone feelings. Judd dismissively replied that she should not call it manipulating because this is sales and he's just selling his muscles. After leaving the hotel, Judd headed to another house. The man of the house had passed away just a few days ago, and without a second thought, the unscrupulous Judd used his muscle-selling skills to scam the widow out of her last bit of money. After a long day's work, Judd was feeling accomplished. After all, widows without families are the easiest to deceive. As dusk approached, he knocked on the door of his next target, a strange elderly couple who looked like they didn't have many years left themselves. Judd began his pitch, saying this cemetery plot is in a beautiful, serene environment. It guarantees them a good rebirth for generations to come. And right now, for only $750, they can receive benefits worth $20,000, and that's a 26-fold return on investment. The old couple couldn't resist such an enticing offer. The old man said he'd go downstairs to get the money, while the enthusiastic old lady led Judd into the kitchen and made him a cup of coffee. The coffee tasted awful, so Judd decided to reheat it himself. But the moment he opened the microwave, he was scared out of his wits. There was a man's head inside. In the corner of the kitchen, another body lay motionless. To his horror, it dawned on Judd that this family was a bunch of killers. Panicked, he tried to escape, but the old man caught up to him and knocked him out with a few blows. It turns out the elderly couple had had enough of pushy salesmen constantly coming to their door offering them shoddy products. The old man, a true psychopath, had been killing these unscrupulous salesmen for years. However, seeing Judd's youthful and tender looks, they decided to spare his life, but on one condition: that he had to marry their ugly daughter. Now, their daughter's appearance was so shockingly dreadful that Judd trembled the moment he saw her, with chills running down his spine to his butt. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of terrible karma her parents have accumulated to bring such a beauty into this world. Being a skilled salesman with a silver, juicy tongue, Judd quickly realized he had to sweet-talk his way out to stay alive. Despite his revulsion, he reluctantly proposed to the girl. She was thrilled and told him that if he married her, not only would he be allowed to leave, but he'd also inherit a massive dowry her father had hidden in the basement. Faced with this generous offer, Judd had no choice but to agree. That very night, under the witness of the old couple, Judd and the girl held a simple wedding. During the ceremony, the girl asked her father to remove Judd's handcuffs, but the old man, distrustful of Judd, refused to unlock them. Insulted by her father's lack of faith, the daughter snapped. Right there at the wedding, she strangled her father to death and for good measure killed her mother too. With her parents dead, the daughter freed Judd from his handcuffs and led him to the basement to dig up her father's hidden dowry. As she dug excitedly, Judd grabbed the old man's fallen gun and shot her ugly dead, while muttering to himself that she should not expect to spend the rest of her ugly life with his handsome figure. With everyone out of his way, Judd hummed a little tick-tock tune as he uncovered the daughter's so-called dowry. But when he opened the chest, it wasn't treasure inside. It was a contract for the cemetery plot he had been trying to sell, with his own name signed on it. At that moment, the old couple reappeared behind him. It had all been an act, a twisted test of Judd's sincerity. And just like the previous salesman, Judd had failed. The one who sold ovens ended up in the oven. The one who sold vacuums was killed by a hose. And the one who sold TVs was stuffed into a television, binge-watching Daniel C.C. horror movies. Judd, a cemetery plot salesman, had dug his own grave. As Judd screamed, they tricked him. The old man replied that he should not call it tricking because this is just sales. The second story begins with a wealthy, middle-aged businessman, Leo, and his wife, who is young, beautiful, and sophisticated, but she is incredibly distant toward him. Suspicious and paranoid, Leo hires a private investigator to secretly follow her and find out if she's having an affair. Yet every detective tells him the same thing. His wife's days consist of grocery shopping and wandering the streets, never any contact with other men, no signs of infidelity whatsoever. But no matter how many investigators try to convince him, Leo refuses to believe it, still thinking that his wife is so much younger than him and so stunning. How could she not be cheating? Desperate for answers, he switches to a new detective agency, one that finally seems to get him. They even confidently guarantee they'll catch his wife in the act. Back at home, Leo starts rummaging through his wife's lingerie, demanding to know why she buys such sexy but smelly underwear. His wife responds that all lingerie is supposed to be sexy and smelly. Later, Leo suggests they be intimate, but his wife coldly rejects him as usual because he's too old to handle it well. This only strengthens Leo's belief that she's having an affair. A week later, the private investigator hands Leo some photos. As usual, his wife is either out shopping or attending church. Still no sign of any infidelity in sight. The detective smirks mischievously and says his wife is so young. What kind of young woman goes to church every day for mass? The detective did some digging, finding that there's a priest at that church, a real handsome young man. So he suspects Leo's wife must have spent all her time getting cozy with that young man. Panicked, Leo drops the photos and rushes to the church where his wife frequently goes. Sure enough, the priest is extremely good-looking, and he's also quite liberal. In his eyes, infidelity, betrayal, or hormone exercise are no big sins. Before finishing his words, the priest hurries off to hear confessions. Just then, Leo notices his wife walking into the confession booth with the priest. His paranoid mind starts to race, conjuring up vivid scenes of the two exercising together. As the saying goes, when you've got cheating on your mind, you see it everywhere. Fueled by jealousy, Leo turns back to the private investigator. Over drinks, he proposes hiring a hitman to kill the priest, saying he wants to shoot him right in his sensitive part and then finish him off with a shot to the head, sending him to meet Jesus ahead of time. The detective, ever the professional, replies that he can arrange for the hitman as long as he gets paid enough. But when the hit happens depends on the hitman's schedule, since they're quite busy in this line of work and murder is no small task. After it's done, they will part ways and never see each other again. The next day, following the detective's instructions, Leo placed the money in a locker at the train station. Eager not to miss the action, he parked outside the church every day, waiting for the hitman to make his move. But after several weeks, the priest was still alive and well. Leo began to feel he'd been swindled. He went back to the station, only to find the money had been taken and the detective long gone. By now, Leo had become utterly obsessed and deranged. He decided to take matters into his own hands and went to the church himself, intending to finish off the priest. Disguising himself in the priest's robes, he hid inside the confession booth just in time for his wife to come in for confession. She spoke softly that she had sinned and was not a good wife. It turned out that Leo's wife had lost her mother during childbirth, and that trauma made her terrified of pregnancy, which explained why she had always refused to be intimate with him. All this fuss, just over such a small misunderstanding. Leo was overwhelmed with guilt. He immediately revealed himself, embraced his wife, and they reconciled on the spot. But just then, the hitman, hired by the detective, arrived to flex his muscles. Leo, smiling, told him that as the person who hired him, the job was now canceled. The hitman, however, wasn't listening. He shot Leo once, right in the sensitive but smelly area, and then another shot to the ear, just as Leo had originally ordered. The hitman was quite efficient in his work. And so, Leo's paranoia led to his own demise, leaving behind his young wife sobbing like a giant baby, drenched in tears. Leo's death, in the end, wasn't entirely undeserved. Had he lived, it would have been the innocent priest taking the bullets for no reason. Now that Leo is gone, his young widow is left to inherit his wealth and likely find herself a new, handsome young lover to live happily ever after. The third story begins with a war photographer, Isaac, proudly showing his latest photos to his idol, Dalton. Dalton praised them, admitting that compared to Isaac's work, his own photos looked like a pile of dog crap. Dalton, once a shining star in the world of photojournalism, had taken many famous news photos, but despite Isaac idolizing him, there was no denying that Dalton's glory days were behind him. Isaac also shared with Dalton some spices he had recently acquired. Everywhere he went on assignment, Isaac collected local spices to send back home to his girlfriend. Back at the news agency, the boss bluntly criticized Dalton's photos, calling them trash with no impact, while praising Isaac's shots as far superior. In an effort to salvage his career, Dalton volunteered to go to a jungle in Central America to capture some more compelling images. The boss agreed, but insisted that he take Isaac along. Before their departure, Dalton visited Isaac's home. He couldn't help but notice how stunning Isaac's girlfriend, Bobby, was. Pure, elegant, a true beauty. Dalton instantly fell for her. Naive Isaac, trusting his idol completely, even invited Dalton to dance with Bobby. That night, Bobby stepped out of the room for a smoke and ran into Dalton, who hadn't gone to bed yet. Dalton told her that she was too beautiful to be wasting her time with a loser like Isaac, but Bobby ignored his advances and asked him to take good care of Isaac during the trip. The next morning, the two of them boarded the plane to Central America. A mercenary told Dalton that the place they were headed was incredibly dangerous. Rumor had it that an entire village had disappeared overnight, with the villagers all dying gruesome deaths from some kind of toxic gas. Knowing the area was contaminated, Dalton suggested that Isaac go to the cursed village in his place, while he stayed behind with the mercenary to take pictures elsewhere in the jungle. By nightfall, Dalton still hadn't captured anything worth printing, but surprisingly, Isaac returned unscathed. Isaac was writing a postcard to his girlfriend Bobby. He described the village as terrifying, filled with decaying corpses, and even the plants were corroded beyond recognition. After finishing the postcard, he handed it to a mercenary friend, asking him to send it out. Dalton, who had learned that Isaac had taken some sensational photos in the village, spent the night sleepless with jealousy. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard Isaac's agonized chicken screams in the middle of the night. Isaac had been infected by the toxic gas from the village, and his body felt as if it were burning alive. Hearing the screams, the mercenary went to get medical help for Isaac, but Dalton stopped him. Watching Isaac writhing in pain, Dalton's face lit up with excitement. Isaac was hardworking, genuine, and clearly the rising star of the news agency, and on top of that, he had a beautiful girlfriend, Bobby. All of this made the washed-up Dalton burn with envy. The next morning, the mercenaries were gathered, swapping war stories, when Isaac, now looking like a zombie, staggered out of the hut. Without hesitation, Dalton grabbed a gun and riddled him with bullets. He explained to the mercenaries that he had no choice. Who knew if Isaac had contracted a contagious disease? The mercenaries were suspicious of Dalton, but still decided to burn Isaac's body on the spot. And so, Dalton returned to the news agency alone, carrying Isaac's photos. These photos catapulted Dalton back to prominence, and once he regained his status, the first person he sought out was Bobby. She showed Dalton the postcard and package that Isaac had entrusted to the mercenary to send before he died. The package included some incense. With her boyfriend now dead, Dalton, playing the role of a concerned colleague and friend, comforted Bobby using his soft words first, but hard muscles later. Afterward, Bobby revealed that she had received a letter from one of Isaac's mercenary friends detailing how Dalton had deceived Isaac into going to the poisoned village and how he had stopped the medic from saving him. Isaac had a habit of collecting spices and sending them to Bobby, and it turned out that he had found some incense in the village and included it in the package. Little did he know that the incense was laced with the same deadly poison that had infected the village. Bobby, now seeking revenge for Isaac, decided to take Dalton down with her. Realizing what was happening, Dalton rushed to the bathroom to wash the poison off, but it was too late. Staring into the mirror, he saw a man whose days were numbered, doomed to die and become a zombie, just like Isaac. The fourth story takes place inside the circus, where a woman, Connie, sits quietly by the window, watching the crowd come and go. Her husband, a psychic clown, starts complaining to her. He has the ability to read minds and is trying to guess what Connie is thinking, but no matter how hard he tries, he keeps failing. Fed up with her psychic husband, Connie says she needs some fresh air. Unexpectedly, her husband uses his powers to control her thoughts. He plants the idea of movement into her mind, and soon, under his control, Connie is at his mercy. Over time, being constantly under her husband's mental influence, their thoughts began to synchronize. Even if blindfolded, she could sense the objects around her husband through sheer mental connection. Since then, the couple made a living in the circus using this ability. The circus was home to many strange and extraordinary characters, like the cute little dwarf, the beautiful conjoined twins, and a fierce, violent female orangutan. Everyone treated the orangutan like a mere animal, bullying her, except for the fire eater, who treated her like a young girl. In truth, Connie and the gentle fire eater had long been fond of each other, though neither had the courage to address it, largely due to Connie's overbearing husband. Her husband was a brutish and unreasonable man. The fire eater was the only one who couldn't stand the way her husband treated her, and would occasionally stand up to him with a few sharp words. That night, while her husband was asleep, Connie quietly went to talk to the fire eater. He confessed that he was sick of circus life and was planning to go to St. Louis to stay with his brother. He asked Connie if she would come with him. Naturally, she wanted to escape her vulgar husband, but she couldn't break free from his mental control. Connie explained that her husband's previous assistant had been beaten to death for disobedience. To avoid the police, her husband had since painted his face with thick makeup. Hearing this, the fire eater was taken aback and joked that her husband needed to worry about breakouts, acne, and clogged pores. As they spoke more deeply, the two found themselves kissing. This moment of passion was sensed by the caged orangutan, who smelled the danger in the air. At that exact moment, her husband woke up from his sleep. Realizing Connie wasn't beside him, he used his powers to summon her back once more. Panicked, Connie rushed back to the bedroom, her clothes disheveled. Naturally, her husband gave her a brutal beating, but this only strengthened Connie's resolve to flee with the fire eater. Unexpectedly, while cooking, Connie's husband read her mind. There was no way he would allow his wife to run off with a pretty boy. Late at night, when all was quiet, he poured gasoline over the fire eater and said he heard he had quit playing with fire and started playing with other men's wives, and that comes with a price. Amidst the screams, the fire eater was burned to ashes, while the orangutan, who had always been treated kindly by him, witnessed the entire scene from her cage, letting out a heartbreaking wail. The next morning, the fire eater's charred body was discovered by his fellow performers. Connie was devastated. Everyone believed the fire eater's death was an accident, but Connie was certain her husband had killed him. She began packing her bags, determined to leave her husband. Once again, her husband tried to control her with his telepathy, but to his shock, Connie's anger broke through his mind control. All he could do was watch as she walked out the door. Alone and drowning in his sorrows, her husband turned to alcohol. After several rounds of drinks, he attempted to call Connie back. A gentle woman's voice responded, saying she can't leave him and she's back. But to his surprise, it wasn't Connie who returned. It was the female orangutan from the cage. The clever orangutan had been secretly teaching herself mind reading all along. Now she was here for revenge. Lifting a butcher's knife, she struck down the husband. The next morning, the circus members found the orangutan devouring the husband's body. Thus, the ordinary orangutan was transformed into a man-eating ape, becoming the circus's new star. The fifth story begins with two brothers. The elder, Billy, had a fiery temper, while the younger was naturally slow-witted, constantly asking why even when reading a magazine. His endless, pointless questions drove Billy to rage, but he would quickly soften and smile, offering comfort. Despite his brother's pig-headedness, Billy, a hot-headed but fiercely protective brother, doted on him endlessly. After all, they were brothers. The scene shifts to Mr. Bird, who makes a living selling ice cream. Every day he drives his ice cream truck to the town right on schedule. Besides that, Mr. Bird entertains the town's kids with his ventriloquist skills, using puppets to put on a show. 2 years ago, Billy also sold ice cream for a living. But when he broke the rules and sold off some of the inventory on his own, Mr. Bird reported him. Not only did his ice cream business go under, but he also ended up spending 2 years in prison. Holding back his anger, Billy bought 2 ice creams. When he handed one to his dim-witted younger brother, he grumbled that he spent 2 years behind bars because of Mr. Bird and wouldn't let it slide. Seeing his brother getting scared again, Billy quickly gave him his ice cream to calm him down. Though a bit slow, the younger brother was still an adult. He worked at a cold beverage factory where Mr. Bird would stop by every day to restock. The factory supervisor praised Mr. Bird to no end for always showing up rain or shine. She would even make sure to dress up nicely to greet Mr. Bird in person. But despite her obvious flirting, Mr. Bird wasn't interested and turned down her invitations multiple times. One day, when the supervisor briefly left, Billy sneaked into the factory. He hoped to convince his younger brother to help him steal some money from Mr. Bird's truck. Billy said they didn't have money or connections and everyone here treats them like trash. Even that old supervisor lady thinks the same. The only way to change how people see them is by getting their hands on some cash. Surprisingly, these words fired up the younger brother, who swore that he'd make those who look down on them pay. Without another word, he slipped into the supervisor's office. The supervisor was in the middle of putting money into her safe when the younger brother barged in. She started cursing at him, but in a fit of rage, he grabbed an ice pick and stabbed her. Billy, staring at his blood-soaked sibling, was shocked, saying he didn't expect him to go and kill someone. Meanwhile, Mr. Bird was waiting in his truck for the factory workers to load it up with goods, but no one was coming out. The supervisor, now bleeding heavily, slowly crawled out of her office. Seeing Mr. Bird about to notice her, Billy quickly dragged her greasy body back with a hook. Impatient, Mr. Bird finally gave up waiting and drove off without ever leaving his truck. Billy had planned to steal some money while Mr. Bird was out of the truck, but to his dismay, Mr. Bird never got out. Worse yet, they now had a murder on their hands. As if that weren't bad enough, just before dying, the supervisor had managed to lock the safe, meaning all their trouble had gotten them nothing. At this point, the younger brother suggested they just rob Mr. Bird's house instead. Given the situation, it seemed like their only option. That night, the brothers broke into Mr. Bird's home with guns in hand. Mr. Bird looked terrified and begged for his shitty life, claiming that reporting Billy wasn't his idea. Before he could finish his sentence, the younger brother shot Mr. Bird dead. Billy shouted for his brother to stop because Bird hadn't even told them where the money was, cursing as he began searching the house for the cash. It turned out that Mr. Bird had hidden the money in the freezer, but before Billy could celebrate, he turned around and realized his younger brother was missing. A gunshot echoed, and someone shot Billy in the leg. Mr. Bird wasn't dead, he had killed the younger brother. The death of his brother devastated Billy, but Mr. Bird sneered that Billy is not the only one with a brother. With that, Mr. Bird turned his back. It turns out Mr. Bird had a conjoined twin brother. Mr. Bird was the aggressive one, while his brother was gentle. Together, they made a killing selling ice cream, drawing kids in with their ventriloquist puppet shows. That was until Billy's brother shot Mr. Bird's brother dead. Furious and heartbroken, Mr. Bird finished off Billy. Mr. Bird's ice cream business continued, but without his twin, it quickly started to go downhill. The kids even began complaining, saying Mr. Bird smelled awful. This is because he spent his days carrying around his dead brother's body. The sixth story begins with Andy, who was having dinner with his wife, but she spent the entire meal fiddling with her ring and necklace. They sat at opposite ends of the table, as if to emphasize the emotional distance between them. Halfway through the meal, his wife broke the silence and asked for a divorce. She craved passion, but Andy was always busy with work, trying to make up for it by giving her pocket money. Out of spite, she even found herself a lover. In her words, cheating is absolutely thrilling. With that, she stormed off to pack her things, announcing that she was heading to Chicago with her lover. No matter how hard Andy begged her to stay, she remained unmoved, even mocking him by calling him a birdman. It enraged Andy so much that he snapped and grabbed her sexy body by the throat. Andy reasoned that he worked his smelly butt off to give her everything, and she blamed him for working too much and then used his money to find a lover. During the scuffle, his wife slashed his face with scissors, and in a fit of rage, Andy grabbed the scissors and stabbed her to death. Cut to a sheriff who was arguing with his wife over the phone. His colleague received a report of a fight and a woman screaming at Andy's house. The sheriff perked up and asked for the address, volunteering to check it out, despite being off duty. His colleague found it odd, wondering why the sheriff was so eager to work overtime. Meanwhile, Andy was preparing to deal with his wife's body when he heard the sheriff knocking on the door. Panicking, he quickly threw on a bathrobe and greeted him. Andy denied any screaming from inside the house, explaining that after a big argument with his wife, she had packed up and left for Chicago. As for the cut on his face, he claimed it was just a shaving accident. The sheriff did a quick sweep of the bedroom, finding nothing out of the ordinary, except for a ring that had fallen near the suitcase. It wasn't a wedding ring, but a university class ring. They then moved on to the bathroom where Andy had hidden his wife's body in the tub. He hurriedly covered her face with foam, barely avoiding the sheriff's detection. Before leaving, the sheriff assured him that if any other officers came by to search, Andy could simply say that the sheriff had already been there. Once the sheriff left, Andy dismembered his wife's body and stuffed it into a suitcase. Since his wife had always talked about running off to Chicago with her lover, Andy decided to ship her body there. As he was about to leave without filling out the shipping form, he ran into the sheriff again, who was working undercover. Right at that moment, the shipping clerk reminded Andy to fill in his name and contact info. Andy nervously scribbled on the form, saying he was heading to Chicago to meet his wife. Coincidentally, the sheriff mentioned he was also heading to Chicago for a case, and the two ended up taking the same train. During the trip, the sheriff casually brought up marriage, remarking that almost all men are dissatisfied with their wives. Then, switching gears, the sheriff asked if Andy had ever thought about killing his wife. He went on to outline a hypothetical scenario describing how Andy might have committed the crime. Though framed as a joke, it felt more like a warning. Uncomfortable, Andy excused himself, but the sheriff followed, even helping himself to Andy's dinner. The sheriff then revealed he was actually tailing a well-dressed drug dealer sitting behind Andy. It turns out the sheriff was investigating drug trafficking all along. Relieved, Andy finally began to eat. But just as Andy relaxed, the sheriff dropped another bomb. The FBI had agents on the train, and they'd be conducting a full luggage search at the next station in 20 minutes. Hearing this, Andy panicked again. He sneaked to the baggage car and switched his suitcase with an identical one, then tossed his own suitcase off the train. Now he figured that his crime would never be uncovered. Feeling more confident, Andy returned to his seat. The sheriff, watching Andy try to act cool, suddenly pulled out a university ring, identical to the one belonging to Andy's wife. That's when Andy realized the truth. The sheriff was his wife's lover, and the sheriff had known all along that Andy had stuffed his wife's body in the suitcase. To prove his innocence, Andy led the sheriff and his colleagues to the baggage car, but when he opened the suitcase, he was stunned to find another body inside. The sheriff exploded with rage, calling Andy a scumbag. He revealed that his wife and Andy's wife had been lovers. After discovering their affair, Andy didn't just kill his own wife, he had also murdered the sheriff's wife. Andy was completely baffled, unable to believe the sheriff's wife was dead too. Just like that, Andy was arrested for 2 murders. The 7th story begins with Waters and 2 other freshmen, dressed only in their underwear, were busy cleaning. The fraternity's guide deliberately made a mess of the spotless floor Waters had just cleaned. To add insult to injury, the guide ordered Waters to kiss the sole of his shoe, which had just stepped in dog poop. Refusal meant immediate expulsion from the fraternity and having his name nailed to the wall of shame. The bespectacled guy on the wall had dropped out of the fraternity during a previous fear challenge. It was rumored that afterward, the fraternity members tormented him to the point of ruining his life. Seeing no other choice, Waters gritted his teeth, closed his eyes, and kissed the guide's shoe before returning to scrubbing the floor. That night was the fear challenge for Waters and the 2 other freshmen. If they made it through, they would become official members of the fraternity. The freshmen swore that once they were in, they'd get revenge on the guide. Just then, Mona, a member of the sorority, showed up. Waters instantly fell for the elegant and beautiful Mona and kissed the back of her hand the moment he met her, though he'd just kissed dog poop. Mona came to propose a joint social event between the 2 groups, but the guide turned her down, saying they had the fear challenge scheduled for tonight. Late that night, the freshmen were blindfolded and brought to an old mansion. The mansion had been abandoned for years after a series of murders decades ago. Even now, it was said a man was heard coughing inside from time to time. The guide explained that the task was simple. The freshmen needed to go to the 2nd floor window, flash their flashlight 3 times, and then go up to the attic and do the same. Once completed, the initiation would be over. It sounded easy enough. Mona and 3 other sorority sisters were there to witness the initiation. The first freshman entered the haunted house. It was as creepy as expected. To add to the atmosphere, the guide had brought a sound effects guy to occasionally play spooky coughing sounds. But shortly after the freshmen went in, the sound of a chainsaw suddenly echoed from inside the house. The sound effects guy standing outside was puzzled since he hadn't played that chainsaw sound. Then, a blood-curdling scream came from within. It seemed the first freshman had been scared out of his wits. The guide quickly called for the next freshman to continue the test. Just like the first, the second freshman climbed the rickety, blood-stained staircase, casually blowing bubbles as he went. He was startled by the sight of fresh blood on the railing, but then laughed it off. It was just strawberry syrup, clearly a prank by the older members to spook them. A few minutes later, another scream rang out from inside the mansion, followed by a severed human arm being thrown out. The guide dismissed it, assuming it was a medical specimen stolen from the university lab by the sound effects guy. Once again, the terrifying chainsaw sound echoed through the mansion, accompanied by the sound of a man screaming in a chicken voice. The sound effects guy was completely bewildered. Both freshmen had lost contact, and anyone with common sense would know something was off in the haunted house. Yet the guide insisted that Waters go in next. Waters wasn't exactly stupid, so he refused his stupid advice. At that moment, the beautiful Mona offered a tempting bribe, a date with her. With that promise, Waters suddenly felt invincible, grabbed his flashlight, and reluctantly entered the haunted house. He called out the names of the previous 2 freshmen, but before long, a figure dressed in a black cloak and holding an axe appeared behind him, causing Waters to tumble down the stairs in terror. Screaming that someone was trying to kill him, the others rushed inside. The guide laughed, calling Waters a coward, saying what he saw was nothing more than a dummy they had placed there earlier. The haunted house stories were all fabricated to scare the freshmen. There were no ghosts here, but Waters swore what he saw was a real person. Just then, the cloaked figure appeared again, causing the guide to collapse in fear. The figure removed the cloak, revealing himself to be the bespectacled guy who had been nailed to the fraternity's wall of shame years ago. After enduring endless torment back then, he had come back today to get revenge on the guide. He had even posted notes in the attic, instructing the 2 freshmen to hide and pretend to be missing. It had all been a harmless prank so far. The guide, now a laughingstock, climbed to the attic in search of the missing freshman. Meanwhile, the sound effects guy downstairs picked up the severed hand that had been thrown earlier and noticed a freshman's ring on it. It turned out the hand wasn't part of a prank. It had just been freshly cut from one of the freshmen. At the same time, the guide discovered bloodied skeletons in the attic. To his horror, he was greeted by the sorority sisters, including Mona, who revealed their true identities. They were a pack of ghouls. That night wasn't just the fraternity's fear challenge. It was also the sororities. Any ghoul who failed to eat one of the male initiates would be nailed to the sorority's wall of shame. And so the arrogant guide met his gruesome end under the chainsaws of these beautiful but deadly women. The eighth story begins with a third-rate magician named Miles, whose performances are as terrible as his personality. Every time he does a magic show, it ends in a fire. Even his assistant, Greta, can't stand it anymore, unable to believe that with skills like that, he still has the nerve to perform on stage. It turns out that Miles was actually the apprentice of the great magician, who mysteriously disappeared 3 months ago. Since then, Miles has been performing under his name, but in doing so, he's ruined his mentor's reputation. Greta confronted him, saying he wasn't cut out for the magic business. Miles agreed with her, so he dismissed her smelly bullshit and fired her. But it wasn't him who did the firing. It was Greta herself, who retorted that she fired her foolish boss. Before leaving, Greta noticed something odd. Miles was wearing the missing magician's medallion, an heirloom passed down in his family. In a flash, she realized Miles must have killed his mentor and stolen his magic secrets. But without a body or evidence, even though she knew Miles had betrayed his mentor, there was nothing she could do. After she left, Miles hired 2 new young and beautiful assistants. Despite the change, his performances remained as awful as ever. The assistants, besides helping with the show, even had to put out literal fires. After one of Miles's dreadful shows, a strange old man appeared backstage. He introduced himself as an illusionist and said he had watched Miles's performance. Though terrible, the old man saw some potential. He then invited Miles to watch his own show the following night. The old man's signature act was the death magic box. The box, which looked like a coffin, was surrounded by knives that would be triggered by a mechanism to plunge into the box. As if that weren't enough, a bottle of acid would also be released from above. The person inside the box would either be severely injured or die. The old man planned to show how to escape the box before a candle burned through the rope, which would trigger the deadly mechanism. But halfway through his performance, the old man suddenly started banging on the box, yelling that something had gone wrong. The audience screamed in terror as the old man appeared to be gravely injured inside the box. However, moments later, he casually reappeared, unharmed, revealing it had all been an illusion. The audience erupted in applause, and even Miles was blown away by the performance. After the show, Miles earnestly asked the old man for advice. The old man explained that the trick was simple. There was a hidden panel inside the box, and all he had to do was push it back 10 inches before the show. That way, the knives wouldn't touch him. As for the acid, the old man said he'd explain it only once. But just as the old man was excitedly demonstrating, he caught sight of Miles's reflection in the mirror. Miles was holding a gleaming knife. It turned out Miles was a magic thief who killed his mentors after stealing their tricks. Without hesitation, Miles stabbed the old man and dumped his body into a lake. Using the half-baked tricks he had stolen, Miles rose from a third-rate magician to a second-rate one, gaining a bit of local fame. A photographer even offered to film Miles's magic show and share it with the world, promising fame and fortune. Miles's big performance was about to begin, but little did he know that Greta, whom he had fired, had sneaked backstage and fixed the hidden panel in place. As usual, Miles got into the magic box while the photographer started filming. Once the box was closed, Miles began applying makeup inside, but soon realized the panel wouldn't move. Panicked, he started banging on the box, screaming for help. The assistants, thinking it was part of the act, ignored him. The candle burned through the rope and the knives plunged into the box. Poor Miles was seriously injured, roaring in agony on stage. Only then did the assistants and audience realize the trick had failed. The photographer called Greta, telling her to keep filming. Then he walked on stage, and right before Miles's eyes, he transformed into the old man and then into Miles's missing mentor. It turned out that Miles's clumsy attempts at murder had always been foiled by his mentor's illusions. Every time, Miles failed to check whether his victims were actually dead. His mentor performed one last demonstration for Miles, causing him to die on stage, full of regret, while the mentor's comeback performance shook the magic world once again. In the end, Miles's betrayal only paved the way for someone else's success. The ninth story begins with a professor introducing the legend of Pharaoh Ramses. According to the tale, Ramses died suddenly before he could marry his beloved queen. Unwilling to leave this world, Ramses began to rise from the dead every year on the anniversary of his death, searching for the queen. Ramses was known for his intense jealousy and possessiveness. To appease him, the townspeople would sacrifice a young girl each year in what became known as a living sacrifice. These girls died in agony, but their deaths kept Ramses's rage at bay, if only temporarily. Meanwhile, top student Stella was furiously taking notes, while class slacker Reggie was daydreaming the whole time. The professor warned Reggie that exams were approaching fast, and if he failed again, he'd lose his spot on the school's soccer team. After school, Stella was working at a restaurant when Reggie approached, asking for her help with his studies. They agreed to meet at the library. Stella thought Reggie wanted to study, but he quickly admitted he couldn't focus at all. His only love was soccer. If he failed, he'd never be able to play for the school team again. Knowing Stella's passion for ancient Egyptian culture, Reggie asked her to distract the professor so he could sneak into his office and steal the exam answers. When Stella refused, Reggie resorted to his charm. With his good muscles and sweet talk, Reggie easily won over Stella, who had never been in a relationship before. That night, Stella visited the professor's home, just as planned. The professor warmly welcomed her and led her to the basement to show off his collection of artifacts, which he said had been passed down from his grandfather. Stella was amazed by the vast array of treasures. The professor then proudly mentioned his most prized possession, something hidden behind a stone door. Inside, he revealed, was a genuine ancient Egyptian tomb. Stella felt a chill and wanted to leave, but the professor's expression suddenly twisted with menace. He wasn't about to let her go so easily, wanting to have a tomb baby with her. Stella clung to the tomb door, desperately calling out to Reggie for help. Reggie managed to pull her away from the professor. However, he scoffed at the professor, saying he couldn't believe a person well-dressed like him can't even handle a woman, before shoving Stella into the tomb and slamming the door shut. After locking her in, the professor grumbled that women these days were getting stronger because of all the fitness programs. Then, standing outside the tomb, he began blowing an ancient horn. It turns out that the owner of the tomb was none other than the legendary Pharaoh Ramses. The professor's ancestors were devout followers of Ramses, and every year they sacrificed a young girl to him in order to appease his anger. Inside the tomb, Ramses grabbed Stella by her chick throat, but luckily, being the smart student she was, Stella knew everything about Ramses's history. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a nearby tiara and pretended to be his beloved queen. The mummy, with his failing eyesight, recognized the tiara but not the person, and Stella managed to escape unharmed. Meanwhile, in the main hall, the professor poured 2 glasses of wine, one for himself and one for Reggie. It turned out that Reggie and the professor had made a deal. Reggie would provide the professor with young girls, and in return, the professor would help him pass his exams. But now that the deal was done, the professor betrayed Reggie by giving him a failing grade. Furious, Reggie threatened to expose the professor's evil deeds. The professor, however, remained unfazed and casually reminded Reggie about the ancient mummification technique they had discussed in class. He explained that the hook used to remove a mummy's brain was paired with a special solution that ancient Egyptian priests would pour down a corpse's throat. After some time, the internal organs would dissolve, and the drink Reggie had just consumed contained that very dissolving agent. Reggie, ever the scatterbrain, hadn't noticed that his drink was different from the professor's. Within moments, Reggie began convulsing, vomiting, and collapsed, dead like a piece of soap. The professor placed Reggie's body in a coffin, but to his shock, the tomb behind him opened on its own. Out stepped Ramses and Stella. What stunned the professor most wasn't that Stella was still alive, but that she had somehow found time to change clothes and put on makeup. Thanks to her attentive note-taking, Stella had saved herself by relying on her extensive knowledge of Ramses's history. The professor had also mentioned in class that Ramses was intensely jealous, so Stella started flirting shamelessly with the professor, batting her eyes and touching him provocatively. Enraged, Ramses grabbed the professor by the throat. Stella handed Ramses the brain-removing hook, and just like that, the professor met his end at the hands of the pharaoh he had worshipped, paying the ultimate price for his selfish cruelty. In the end, the police found Stella. She had mummified both Reggie and the professor and submitted them as her project to her new professor, earning top marks. Bookish as she was, Stella hadn't considered that this would also put her on the police's radar. The 10th story begins with a blonde beauty flirting with a man in front of her. She excuses herself to the bathroom, promising to join him afterward. Sitting on the toilet, she picks at some food stuck between her unbrushed teeth when suddenly the bathroom lights go out. She sees a pair of high-heeled shoes standing outside the stall. The door swings open, and before she can react, a long-haired woman with an axe starts hacking at her. Cut to a man named Roger, who's driving to his vacation cabin. On the other side of the road, a girl named Norma finds her pickup truck breaking down in the middle of a rainstorm. Stranded with nowhere to go, she flags down Roger's car for help. Ever the gentleman, Roger offers her a ride. Norma explains that she's currently homeless and can't afford to stay at a hotel. Roger, lonely and without company, finds Norma smell good and invites her to stay with him at his hormone-smelly cabin. On the way, Roger stops at a convenience store to pick up supplies. The store owner warns him that things haven't been safe lately. He just heard that someone's pickup truck got stolen nearby, and a few days ago, a woman was brutally murdered in a bathroom. Roger begins to suspect Norma. The stolen truck was found close to where he had picked her up. He realizes that Norma might be a thief. Norma, planning to steal Roger's car, is caught off guard when Roger returns to the vehicle just in time. The two eventually arrive at Roger's luxurious cabin. Roger proudly shows her a mounted axe on the wall, claiming it was used by executioners to chop off heads. He tells Norma she can go upstairs to change into some dry clothes, adding that the women's clothing belongs to his ex-girlfriend. Although Roger claims they broke up a long time ago, the clothes still carry a faint scent of perfume. Norma assumes Roger is just a wealthy playboy and begins rummaging through the house, stuffing valuables into her bag. After her loot is secured, Norma changes into a beautiful dress and comes downstairs for dinner with Roger. Struck by how stunning Norma looks, Roger retrieves a priceless gemstone necklace from his safe and places it around her neck. During dinner, they talk about opera. Roger, who sees through her act, admits he knows she's a thief. He just wants to know why she stole the car. Norma confesses that she caught her boyfriend cheating on her and had dealt with both her boyfriend and the other woman. Roger, ever understanding, says he's willing to take Norma in. After dinner, the two are about to get more intimate when a noise suddenly comes from downstairs. Roger goes to check it out, and Norma hears an argument between Roger and a woman. Roger panics and tells Norma that his wife is home. For her safety, he shoves Norma out into the pouring rain. Inside, the woman's voice continues, searching the house for Norma. Norma could have grabbed her stolen goods and left. Just the jewels she took would be enough for her to live on for a while. But her greed gets the better of her and she sneaks back inside, tiptoeing to the safe. She accidentally steps on a remote, turning on the TV. On the screen, a woman with heavy makeup angrily accuses Roger of cheating. But the woman's face, it's Roger's. The horrifying truth dawns on Norma. Roger is a deranged man with split personalities. He is both the jealous wife and Roger himself. Whenever he lures a woman in, he puts on a wig, high heels, and becomes his wife, who, driven by jealousy, murders these women. As Norma processes the revelation, Roger quietly lifts the axe from the wall and slowly approaches her. The door is locked, and there's no escape. All that awaits Norma is death. In this story, both Norma and Roger had ulterior motives, one driven by greed, the other by lust and madness. In the end, it's a fitting tale of how evil meets its match. The 11th story takes place in the dead of night, at a graveyard where Jerry is sweating profusely as he digs up a grave, with his girlfriend Gina standing by seductively, exchanging flirtatious glances with him. From inside the coffin, there's a banging sound and a man pushes the lid open, climbing out that he's nearly suffocated down there, and they two are up here undressing for a hormone yoga session. As it turns out, the three are a scam team specializing in faking deaths to swindle money. This time, they've managed to con 20,000. The accomplice, however, has had enough of Gina's flirtatious behavior and starts yelling at her. In the heat of his rant, Jerry shoots him dead, sending him to his grave efficiently. That's what happens when you badmouth someone's girlfriend right in front of him. Talk about digging your own grave. After burying the accomplice, Jerry and Gina quickly get back to work. This time, Gina plays the role of a confident, wealthy businesswoman, and she quickly catches the attention of a group of bar patrons. One young man jokes that Gina must be a lesbian, only to get a punch in his private part, leaving him almost incapacitated. Gina then grabs him by the chin and starts berating the entire table, accusing them of disrespecting women. Her boldness piques everyone's curiosity about her profession. Gina claims she works for an oil and gas company and is here on a special mission to survey the land. With the introduction set, it's time for Jerry to make his appearance. He claims to have discovered an oil well in the nearby cemetery, and spotting outsiders in the room deliberately lowers his voice, further piquing the patron's interest. Gina raises her voice just enough for everyone to hear, saying that the head office isn't aware of the find yet, and she's planning to buy the land herself. But she only has $5,000. She then starts encouraging the patrons to pool their money together for a share in the oil well. Naturally, they don't want to miss out on such a lucrative opportunity. Soon, the group manages to scrape together $25,000. Gina and Jerry take the scammed patrons to the cemetery to inspect the oil well themselves. Gazing at the bubbling leak, the patrons are ecstatic, already dreaming of starting a company. One of them suggests buying up all the surrounding farmland to avoid drawing suspicion, estimating that it would cost $320,000 in total. Gina agrees to contribute $70,000, but says the rest will need to come from the group. To persuade them to fork over the remaining $200,000, Gina reluctantly coughs up her $70,000 as a sign of good faith. Just when she's about to take the patrons' money and make a run for it, Jerry starts arguing with her. He accuses Gina of being too greedy, saying her greed will eventually catch up with them. Furious, Jerry storms off, leaving Gina with the conned patrons and a plot spiraling out of control. The next morning, the bar patrons track down Gina, having seen her and Jerry together and suspecting the two were in on the scam. Gina lied, claiming that Jerry had taken all the money and that she was innocent. To prove her innocence and sever any ties with Jerry, she injected him with a dose of acid, killing him on the spot. With Jerry dead, none of them could escape the situation. To keep things quiet, they quickly buried Jerry. Late that night, Gina was frantically digging up Jerry's grave. It turns out the injection was actually a voodoo serum that induces a death-like state. Now that they had successfully scammed the money, all Gina had to do was dig up Jerry and the two of them could flee together. However, to her shock, Jerry was standing by the grave alive and well, while inside the coffin was one of the bar patrons. Their accomplice, who had been presumed dead earlier, emerged carrying Gina's money. It was all a setup from the start. Jerry and the accomplice had orchestrated the entire plot to trick Gina into handing over her own savings of $70,000. Gina had always been the dominant figure in their group, a feminist who not only led, but also reinvested the scammed money, which had long frustrated Jerry and the accomplice. The bar patron climbed out of the grave only to discover his shoes covered in oil. It turns out there really was oil beneath the cemetery. Realizing that the group had deceived her and knowing they wouldn't let her go, Gina, in a moment of defiance, flicked her cigarette onto the ground. The explosion that followed engulfed the entire graveyard, consuming them all, along with their deceit, greed, and betrayal, causing the story to fall into a fiery end. The 12th story begins with a businessman named Roger arriving at the morgue, where his partner Danny had been found dead at home. Danny's body was grotesque, almost zombified, as if he had died from poisoning. The police discovered traces of a glowing substance in his body, the very preservative that Roger and Danny had been developing together. At the scene, they also found a note that read, "He will neither forget nor forgive." When Roger lifted the sheet covering Danny's body, he noticed strange markings on his skin, and his mind flashed back to 6 years ago. Back then, Roger, Danny, and 2 other friends had ventured deep into the Brazilian rainforest in search of a miraculous plant whose sap had preservation properties. To test their new preservative formula, Roger went so far as to use living subjects from the local tribe as experiments. Returning to the present, Roger was now a director at a chemical company. Exhausted, he returned home, only to find the same words scrawled across his wall. Nearby, someone had left a half-red, half-white doll. Roger called the sheriff, bewildered about who could be after him. The recent string of incidents had given him splitting headaches, forcing him to take aspirin regularly to cope. After the sheriff left, Roger sat playing with an old, polished skull, his mind drifting back to 6 years ago. After a series of human experiments, their preservative formula was nearly perfected, but their visas were about to expire, forcing them to leave prematurely. Danny had asked about the whereabouts of their colleague, Alex. It turned out that the tribe hadn't provided the dying subjects for free. In exchange for their cooperation, Roger was required to offer up one of his colleagues as a living sacrifice. Poor Alex became the sacrificial lamb. Roger personally administered the preservative to Alex, watching as he was sealed in a coffin and carried away. 6 years had passed. Perhaps by now, Alex's remains had long disintegrated. The scene shifts back to the present, where Roger is giving an interview. The company's new preservative can keep apples fresh for up to 2 years, and if it were mass-produced, it could potentially solve food shortages. After the interview, Roger takes some aspirin for his persistent headaches. His assistant informs him that Danny's mysterious death has caused a delay in the preservative's approval, which could lead to the company's bankruptcy if the issue isn't resolved. The assistant suggests Roger seek help from one of their sidekick colleagues who had accompanied them on the trip to the Brazilian rainforest years ago. With Alex left behind as a sacrifice and Danny now dead, this sidekick colleague was Roger's last hope. When Roger visits his house, he discovers that the sidekick colleague had also been injected with a lethal dose of preservative and was found dead. Next to his body was the same note with the same words. In a state of madness, Roger confronts his assistant, accusing him of murdering their colleagues one by one. On the surface, Roger appeared calm and gentlemanly, but his darker side was terrifying. In a fit of rage, he kills his assistant, convinced he was responsible for the deaths. Little did Roger know, Alex, who had been sacrificed 6 years ago, had returned from the shadows. Alex had spent those 6 years under the torment of voodoo and curses, transforming into a zombie that retained both memory and consciousness. Roger believed Alex had returned to exact revenge, but Alex picked up the note found at the crime scene and compared it to Roger's own documents. The truth emerged. It turns out after years of heavy aspirin use, Roger had developed severe hallucinations. It wasn't Alex who had killed their colleagues, it was Roger's own dark side. Tragically, poor Alex had spent 6 years struggling to escape, only to be stabbed to death by Roger, who then decapitated him. In desperation, Roger sought help from a famous sorcerer. The sorcerer picked up a voodoo doll from the table and explained that Roger had fallen victim to a sinister, double-sided curse. Roger's prolonged abuse of aspirin had unleashed his dark side, and the curse had magnified it, pushing him to commit violent acts. The sorcerer offered a solution, but warned that curing the curse would come at a cost to Roger's well-being. Not caring about the consequences, Roger lay down on the altar, surrounded by eerie, unsettling tools. After the ritual, Roger called his secretary, requesting that she bring some preservative to his apartment. Smiling, he claimed to have defeated the voodoo curse Alex had cast on him. He then prepared to inject himself with the preservative. In the dim light, the secretary let out a blood-curdling scream. The ritual had transformed Roger into a dual-faced monster. Whether or not he would survive after injecting the preservative remains a mystery. The 13th story begins with a luxury car pulled into a desolate forest. The bald driver forces a beautiful woman, Lucy, out of the car. Today is the day she will die. The driver's man, already wearing gloves and an apron, is preparing to deal with Lucy's body once the deed is done. Terrified, Lucy watches as the bald man removes her jewelry and clothes, planning to give them to his wife and daughter. It all started not too long ago. Lucy was a waitress at a bar where Johnny, a smooth-talking man, was cozying up to his wealthy girlfriend, oblivious to the world around them. The bald man was the rich woman's right-hand man. At one point, the woman asked Johnny if he thought Lucy was attractive. Johnny, ever the charmer, replied that the only woman he saw was her. His sweet talk paid off, and his girlfriend promised him a special hormone therapy later that night. After her shift, Lucy's co-worker warned her to stay away from the couple, telling her that the wealthy woman was a notorious black widow who killed without blinking. Lucy was well aware of the woman's dangerous reputation, but she had already fallen for the handsome Johnny. Captivated by his looks, Lucy couldn't resist him. Johnny promised that once he got his hands on the money from his girlfriend's safe, he would run away with Lucy and they could live happily ever after. Just as the two were about to get intimate, a noise came from outside the door. Johnny quickly hid Lucy and dressed himself, trying to act calm. His wealthy girlfriend entered the room with her business partner, complaining that the diamonds he had sold her were fake. The business partner didn't hold back, saying the wealthy woman was getting old, her menopause was making her paranoid, and that women should stay home where they belong. Infuriated by his words, the wealthy woman grabbed a weapon and stabbed her business partner to death. Johnny had seen this kind of thing many times before, but Lucy, hiding nearby, let out a terrified chicken scream. In a desperate attempt to distance himself from the situation, Johnny slapped Lucy, accusing her of being a thief. The wealthy woman wasn't fooled. She hit Johnny too, furious at his betrayal. This wasn't the first time Johnny had cheated on her. His previous flings had all ended up in pieces, dismembered by the wealthy woman, and it looked like Lucy was about to meet the same fate. So Lucy was taken to a remote forest where the wealthy woman ordered Johnny to kill her as a show of loyalty. Lucy, in disbelief, realized that the man she had loved was a selfish, heartless bastard. As she gazed at the rising sun, her mind raced with thoughts. Just as she braced herself for death, Johnny suddenly turned and shot the right-hand man and his man. Realizing the situation had gone wrong, the wealthy woman fled for her shitty life in her car. Johnny wrapped a coat around Lucy and apologized profusely, showing he wasn't as heartless as she had thought. Now that the wealthy woman knew of his betrayal, Johnny decided to take the plunge. There was no turning back. The two armed themselves and headed to the wealthy woman's bar, unleashing a barrage of bullets on her henchmen. For all her bodyguards, they were no match for Johnny's skills. The wealthy woman tried to run but failed. Johnny and Lucy captured her, forcing her to give up the code to her safe. But that wasn't enough for Lucy. She made the wealthy woman strip off her coat and jewelry and put them on herself, just as the right-hand man had done to her earlier. Then, right in front of her, Lucy had Johnny shoot the wealthy woman. Johnny happily packed up the money from the safe, but suddenly, Lucy pointed a gun at his head from behind. It turns out, Lucy had only been using Johnny as a pawn to get the money for herself. But as the gunshot rang out, it was Lucy who fell to the ground. It was all an illusion of Lucy. Lucy had never left the execution site. Everything, Johnny killing the right-hand man and saving her life, was just a fantasy in Lucy's mind as she faced death. In the end, she couldn't escape her fate of being buried in the wilderness. After killing Lucy, Johnny lit a cigarette and returned to his life of luxury with the wealthy woman. Lucy wasn't the first woman Johnny had led to her death, and she wouldn't be the last. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.